What's up, Travis with TCustomz Productionz, TCustomz.com. I just tried to record this, and apparently it was not recording. So this is the second time going through this, but this is a beat breakdown or an inside look into a new track that I just finalized and uploaded entitled Lyrical Carnage. I uploaded the instrumental a few days ago, as well as a quick condensed beat making video, recreation video, and today I want to step you inside of the session and give you a different perspective on this, hopefully give you a little insight for those of you who have been asking me. It's actually a 1970s jazz fusion record that I'm sampling here. I took a little bit different approach. I talked about before of a day that I set time aside and just went through and chopped, say, 4 or 5 different records, had saved them and came back, revisited them later instead of just working all in a single session and kind of creating it start to finish. This track, I started with my drums first. I've got my kick and snare we'll get into. And one other thing that is a little bit different with this is I actually am going back and forth between MIDI and audio. My regular verse sequence track, it's all in MIDI. And then you'll see this break. I didn't actually have a set hook for this beat. I actually have just a breakdown, and it's a little easier for me to manipulate time stretch and do some different things in audio format. And so I opted to transition out of this MIDI into audio and then go back into MIDI for the actual verse. But other than that, let's just go ahead and get into the kick and snare track. As we can see, these are 2 separated tracks. I get a lot of questions about quantizing or not quantizing. How do you get a certain groove? And there's different approaches I take. Sometimes I've used in the past the Ableton drum grooves. You've got MPC grooves. You've got a lot of stuff there that you can experiment with. Sometimes I'll click in my drums and maybe manually shift some of the timing on some of the notes, or just go ahead and record them in, say, on my drum pad or on my keyboard. In this case, I actually did record the drum pattern in from my MIDI keyboard, but I ended up quantizing the majority of the drums. All my snares are, you know, on the grid, and all my primary kicks are on the grid as well. The only variation of that is my little ghost kick you'll see right here. This is off. I also have varied the velocity here, but all of these main kick notes are quantized on the grid. And then also this this kick here, beginning of this. So you already start to get a little bit of groove just by these few notes being shifted in the velocity change. Also, when I added my percussion and hi-hats is where you can get a little more swing and feeling. Pretty much my hi-hats and my shakers are both off the grid. We'll get into that in a little bit. Next, I started visiting the sample. I want to give you a little preview of what that sounds like. I'm going to disable the effects that I use first. Did end up pitching that down 3 half steps. This was again a sample that I had already chopped previously, had about 100 chops. Added a 51 millisecond attack to the beginning of all these sample chops just to make sure that there's no clicking or any unwanted noise at the beginning when they're triggered. As usual, high pass filter, simple delay, and I also just did add a little high shelf to this just to enhance some of the higher end right here. Then in a video earlier I covered this panning randomization, which I implemented for this 8.6% random panning to kind of give a little extra stereo effect to your MIDI sample chops. And all the stuff that I'm mentioning here, I'll make sure to link those in the description if you're interested, if you haven't seen those particular videos. And then the actual MIDI sequence, I took the approach, I shot a video before on piecing together the puzzle and not necessarily being able to record a 4, 8-bar, 16-bar loop all in one take, but more so working with 2 or 3 sample chops, record those in, maybe at the beginning, then at the end of the sequence, record a couple of those in, and then just kind of fill in the gaps. And that's the approach that I took for this. You'll see sample chops kind of everywhere, a lot of trial and error. It might take me 20 minutes. It might take me 2 hours, 3 hours to get a nice 8 or 16-bar sequence the way that I want. One thing to note really quickly before I play this back is that you notice that there's not a MIDI note at the beginning of this sequence. Typically, you'll have a note here when the downbeat hits. The reason why I don't is because the way that this loop works is that initial sample is actually triggered prior to this sequence starting. So as the track loops back around, it makes a little more sense. I'm going to play this 8-bar loop through, and you'll notice here at the end what I'm talking about. This is the end of the loop, and this is actually the new note that's being triggered at the end of the sequence, but it's also extending through and playing at the very beginning. If I zoom back in on this sample sequence, another technique that I'm using here, and I've talked about this as well, as this delay emulation, more or less. You're just changing the velocities on the single MIDI chop or MIDI note that's emulating a delay sound. I'm also using that same technique towards the end of the sequence. And then throughout, there are just some other minor velocity variations. Next, I have a hi-hat and a shaker track. Not too overcomplicated, something still kind of simple. I didn't want a lot of extra percussion in this track. It's a very simple hi-hat track, and the shakers also give a little more movement. These are pretty much, for the most part, off the grid. I don't think any of these notes are directly synced. I've got an open hat and a closed hat. You'll see everything's pretty much off the grid. You'll see a lot of velocity variations to give that extra feel. The next percussion track was a shaker track where I'm layering actually 2 shaker sounds to get this sound. Same thing here, very loose fill, unquantized. Okay, so before I got into the bass line, I went ahead and added a couple more percussive sounds. One added to the snare. I'm adding a little tambourine. I have 2 tambourines layered with a high threshold on a high pass filter, some reverb, a 2/2 delay, the very subtle push back in the mix, and then also a rattle. Then I put a delay, filter, and reverb on as well. So you got the tambourine coming down first, and the rattle on this kick. Again, just some little nuanced percussion, nothing too crazy. Next, I got into the bass line, and I'm using a patch from the TCustomz bass sample pack. This is actually the bass patch number 2. You can hear I have the pitch bend or the glide enabled on this. A couple things I want to mention when it comes to creating a bass line that I've talked about before, specifically in the demonstration video where I talk about how to set this up. Whether you're using a single bass note to spread across your keyboard or you're using an existing bass patch, is in most cases you're going to want to have your notes cut each other off. In the Ableton sampler, there's an option for voices. By default, I think it's set at 6. And this basically means that if you set it at 1, there's going to be no overlap. There's only going to allow one note to play at any given time. It might be set up as polyphony, or it could be a number of different settings that you might see in your plugin or software. But by doing this, it ensures that there's not going to be any bleed over with your bass notes, because a lot of times if you do that, it's going to cause a lot of frequency issues. I've had people send me their beats to be mixed before, and their bass track just had a bunch of collision in the low end, and at that point there's not really much I can do with it. So to eliminate that, just make sure in most cases that your bass notes are cutting each other off and you don't have that overlap. And another thing I mentioned was the glide, and that can be set up in most of your plugins or software, virtual instruments. In the Ableton sampler, it's in the pitch oscillation tab. There's a glide option. By default it's off, and I just set that to glide, and you can adjust the timing. I'm going to play back this bass line. You'll be able to hear this glide actually come in 2 different places, right here towards the end, and then also at the very end you'll see this overlap. That was just some experimentation, and it sounded pretty good to me with those sample chops that I had. Next is when I added a crash cymbal. It's pretty straightforward. I'm adding this at the beginning of every, 2 bars it looks like. It doesn't look like I did any additional processing on this. If I go back to the original sample track where I did this little delay effect right here, while I like that fade out, it also seemed to me a little empty there, and so I wanted to potentially put a filler sample layered on top of that, maybe a little effect or just something to fill up some of that space. So what I did was I revisited the sample. I basically had this 8-bar sequence looped up, and I was just re-triggering different places in the sample with this new track. I had a really high threshold because I just wanted a lot of the higher end to come through there. So this was the part of the sample. Then when I put this high pass filter, and then a delay. So I'm going to play this back. The first 4 bars won't have this effect, and the second 4 bars I'll enable this to come in. Again, something very subtle and nuanced. Took a little bit of time to get that in there, but I like the way that sounded. So next I was looking for at least one more interesting element to keep the track moving along, keep the energy up, something else I could throw in from time to time. What I did was I revisited another sample in the same album that I pulled this sample from. Sometimes I'll incorporate samples from multiple records into the same track. Shot some videos in the past on, some of the ways that I approach that, but I found a part of this record. Sounds like this. I've already pitched this up 2 half steps. So I worked with that in audio again because it's easier to manipulate as far as time stretching. So that's going to come in after 4 bars. So I like the way everything was progressing here, and I started looking at some transitional sounds. I ended up using a tom roll, which I'll get into, chimes, and some other transitional effect here. The tom roll did some automated filtering on as well as automated panning. Then when I enable my filters, rolling off a little bit of the low end, and then I automate slowly increasing the highs on this. And also, like I mentioned, a left to right pan, say 31L, and then goes to about 35R. So you just get that quick sweep from left to right. Chimes is very straightforward. I did roll off some of the low end. I did pitch it up, it looks like 5 half steps. And then another swoosh sound that's, I'm layering all these together essentially. So the last couple things that I did, one is in the second verse, put a reverb snare that I'm layering with my original snare. I talked about this before in a separate video to show you how to create like a splash effect. Just do the reverb in one track and layer that with your original snare. As you can see, I got the reverb, I got the high pass filter. In this case, I did shave off some of the high end to get this sound, and then layered with the snare. I didn't have a set hook on this track. As you can see with the intro is audio. After the 16 bars, I transition and we go into audio again and back. And this is basically just a segment of the sample. And because this is such a long segment, it's a lot easier to work with and manipulate in audio format versus trying to get the timing and everything right with a really long MIDI note. The way that the intro and breakdown end, it nicely transitions back into the verse. Also did some slight automated panning, so we're getting a little stereo effect there. In the second verse, as you can see, this little pink area here is when I introduce a few new sample chops just to give some variation. So I'll play this through. So I did this decay effect here, and then I did the opposite to kind of build back up. I think the very last thing is just a vinyl static sound. And that was only during the intro and breakdown, as you can see. I think I covered all the tracks. You'll notice some little subtle panning. That's just to make room during the mix. I'll make sure to link all the stuff that I mentioned, all the videos and tutorials and things in the description, or if not, you can go back to the channel and I have some various playlists there if you're interested. If you have any other questions, let me know. Thanks for watching. Hope this is helpful, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.